Hello, and thank you for joining us. Welcome to a new episode of Power and Flower. I am Seth Maskett.
And I'm John Hagner.
We are a political scientist and a political consultant who are trying to understand and explain what is going on in U.S. politics. We also care deeply about pastries. Today, we're going to talk about the New York City mayoral election and the Democratic nomination of Zohran Mamdani. It's annoying to me, if not that surprising, that the national media are so focused on this one primary election in one city's government. I challenge people out there to name any candidate in any other city election where they don't live. But what is surprising, to me anyway, is that we're still talking about this election 2.5 weeks after it ended. The quick version here is that Zohran Mamdani is a 31-year-old New York State Assemblyman. He is Muslim of Indian heritage and born and raised in Uganda. He describes himself as a democratic socialist, advocating for some left-leaning policies like free city buses, public childcare, city-owned grocery stores, and rent freezes. What we might call the Democratic establishment, I use the term cautiously, including figures like Bill Clinton, Michael Bloomberg, Kirsten Gillibrand, were devoted to preventing his nomination for mayor. And they ended up backing scandal-tainted former Governor Andrew Cuomo for the job. They gave Cuomo all sorts of advantages in terms of endorsements and money and fame, and Mamdani won by double digits anyway. And yet, even after the election was over, a number of more moderate Democrats have continued to trash Mamdani, and some are trying to coordinate to stop him in the general election. Today, we're basically going to talk about just why there's so much party fretting about him and what this actually means more broadly for the Democratic Party going into 2026. So, John, I have a question for you I'd love to ask. I know you had some ties professionally to the Mamdani campaign. But I do want to ask, can you give us some ideas of just what his winning coalition in the primary looked like, and to what you credit his surprising victory?
Yeah, absolutely. My business partner at Workbench Strategy, Jane Rayburn, was Zoran's pollster. She's brilliant and she's amazing. I do not speak for her on any of this. I've never met him. I was not involved in the campaign. I, supported Jane through, and we have an incredible team, a lot of whom worked hard on this race. So, we're really excited that he is a Workbench client. But I personally deserve zero of the credit on this. But I've paid careful attention to the race because of the involvement of my company and my good friends. But I think Zoran's coalition was progressive ideologues, but it was also folks who were just fed up with the status quo in New York Democratic politics. If you look geographically, he did really well in Brooklyn. He did well in Manhattan. He did well in Queens, particularly in they call it the Commie Corridor. There's a very progressive part of Queens that he did very well in. He struggled in the Bronx. He didn't do as well in Staten Island, although he did better than I think folks expected him to in the Democratic primary in Staten Island. But he was able to win a pretty broad coalition. One place that he did better, I think, than expected going in, and better than some progressive challengers have done in previous Democratic primaries, is with African American voters. And I think that that's a big and important part of the story. Like Zoran won Harlem, which I think people had looked to be, remain a real source of sort of Democratic establishment votes. But he won by dominating attention. Something that I think is hard to get your brain around here is. Turnout was a record high in the New York City Democratic primary, but it was still in abject terms quite low in absolute terms. So there are just over 1 million votes cast in the New York City Democratic primary, but there are 3.5 million registered Democratic voters in the city. So turnout was higher than it has been. Zoran got more votes in the primary than any Democratic candidate for mayor maybe ever, or certainly in decades, has gotten. So just like we saw the exact same pattern when AOC beat Joe Crowley in another New York City Democratic primary, turnout was higher in that congressional primary than it had been in previous congressional primaries, but it was still only about 15% of the registered voters in that district. So I think this is a pattern that we're saying is these primary challenges tend to be more successful when total turnout rates are lower, even if the turnout in the specific election is higher than in sort of cognate elections. But Zoran persuaded a lot of Democratic primary voters to turn out, but he also persuaded a lot of regular Democratic primary voters to support him. But he did also turn out a new and much younger part of the electorate. That voters under 50 really powered his success.
Mm. I'm just sort of generally on this topic. Like, what kind of threat do you see Mamdani posing to the Democratic Party broadly? Like, why are national figures so focused on this particular contest, even after the election is over?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think, to be fair, there are also a lot of national figures who are excited and who are embracing
Sure.
Mamdani.
Yeah. Yes.
There are, I think what we're seeing here is a really big divide between the national Democratic establishment, which is either neutral to enthusiastic, and the New York State and New York City Democratic establishment, which has been pretty hostile. And I think that that's a distinction worth sort of digging into as we get down. But no, I think that Cuomo represented so much of the old Democratic Party that his father was governor, he was a member of the cabinet, he was governor, his brother is a CNN anchor. He has kind of impeccable credentials from the old establishment, and he's also profoundly unlikable and a terrible candidate, which also doesn't make him that distinctive, sadly, from a lot of the folks in the establishment. I think
He
this
actually resigned the governorship in disgrace, which is
in disgrace,
outside of Illinois. That's really rare. Yeah.
not very long ago, right?
Yes. Yes.
And never apologized for what he did, never apologized for his behavior. That I think the most interesting part of the Mamdani win is not how did he beat Andrew Cuomo, because Andrew Cuomo was a nightmare. It's how did he turn it into a one-on-one race against Cuomo, against a field of other candidates. Like that to me is the more interesting part of the story, because Cuomo is a terrible candidate, and so much of Mamdani's success is that he was running against Andrew Cuomo, who is a moral and ethical nightmare. But I think that the reason that the New York establishment in particular is freaked out by Mamdani is that the tools that the establishment has at its disposal, which is sort of endorsements, money, the ability to dominate attention through old-fashioned means, didn't work. And I think that is the bigger concern. I think right now, Schumer and Jeffries are not really speaking up about this race. They're trying to avoid topics. But the threat of I think the real threat of Mamdani is that he managed to win by dominating modes of attention that the Democratic establishment has not historically been good at dominating. So, Mamdani's win had a lot to do with his social media presence. It had a lot to do with his viral videos that he could turn around in a day. It didn't have a lot to do with Wall Street fundraisers that, raised millions of dollars. Obviously, Mamdani raised money. New York has a public financing system that enabled him to leverage the small dollar donors into enough money to communicate. But I think his success comes through channels that are not particularly well controlled by party establishment, and that is scary.
Yeah, this really surprised me. There are younger New Yorkers, and I would count my own kids in this, who were clearly like really interested in Mamdani, knew about him through sort of unconventional approaches, such as TikTok videos, a lot of
Yeah.
social media stuff. And he was very good, clearly, at generating interest and getting attention among younger voters, which I would usually think is probably not that great a way to succeed in an election. Just because younger voters are usually pretty low turnout. It gets some attention, but it usually doesn't translate into votes. But in this case, it seems to have worked, or maybe the combination of that and a front runner who everyone disliked
Yeah.
really helped.
What I think that the social media and the youth energy helped raise his profile above people like Brad Lander and Adrian Adams and Scott Stringer and the rest of the field. And it helped, I think, turn it into a one-on-one with Cuomo. I think the other thing that it did is it powered a lot of volunteer energy. That
Mhm.
the door knocking operation that the campaign put together was incredibly impressive. And there's a lot of political scientists will disagree about how effective knocking on doors can be. But
Mhm.
most of that is coming and looking at in the context of a high turnout presidential general election, where the impact of a grassroots campaign is really small. But in a primary election where a lot of voters are up for grabs, where there aren't so many locked in, we're going to vote for this party no matter what, and again, where turnout is generally much lower, I think you see the impact of those field efforts much more. So I think that
Mhm.
the youthful energy that he was able to generate through his attention seeking, um, really did translate into a machine that could help talk to older voters, could talk to folks who, sort of maybe not ideological democratic socialists in the same way, but could branch out to them. And I think did that really well.
Mm.
I think one of my questions about, and I think I'm curious if there's a political science answer for this, is, as I said, so much of Mondami's win came because he was running against Cuomo. And if you look at the Democratic establishment in New York in general, Kathy Hochul barely won in a good Democratic year in 2022. Eric Adams, approval ratings are really low. There seems to be a trend where, New York, which should be a huge driver of Democratic energy, tends to really lag. And there's a lot of Republicans sitting in districts that Joe Biden won in New York. Do you have any kind of political science theory for why the Democratic establishment in New York would be so weak and would, have their standard bearer be somebody like Andrew Cuomo?
This has been something I've noticed. I don't know that I have a really good theory for it, but that, like, there obviously New York's a very prominent state, very big in the Democratic Party for basically forever, and it's the leaders it produces are kind of shockingly uninspiring or corrupt or just kind of lousy lately. Probably the last mayor who had a reputation for competence is probably Michael Bloomberg, and he was sort of borderline. What wasn't clear whether he was a Republican or Democrat for a long
I mean,
time.
he was
Um,
elected as a Republican.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Although he definitely leans left more today.
sure.
Um, Bill De Blasio was kind of just widely ridiculed for his mayor, and people thought they couldn't do worse until they found Eric Adams, who's been kind of just an ongoing cartoon. You have these two like the two Democratic leaders in the House and Senate are both from New York, and they seem to be they're basically lightning rods for everything that everyone's complaining about the Democratic Party for. They're just not really rising to the moment. They seem too accommodationist and uninspiring. Um, I don't have a great sense. I mean, one
Yeah.
thing I think New York has a very long reputation, both the city and the state. For being kind of a machine political system, particularly on the Democratic side. I mean, this is the home of Tammany Hall, which dates back to the late 18th century and goes well into the 20th. You have sort of kind of machine politics in Albany, which there are pluses and minuses to party machines, but one of the things they tend to be is not that ideological, not that inspiring. They're very good at just sort of maintaining power and keeping their people in there. That could be part of what's going on in there. And you also have a state legislature there that has really developed a system over a long period of time for just kind of the having the governor, the leader in the Senate, leader in the assembly, just kind of come up together in a room with what is going to be the law, and everyone else in the state government kind of ratifies that, which can be efficient but not very inspiring. And some people complain of corrupt deals all the time. Um, so it's not the most open system, it's not the most inspiring system, but why they keep producing kind of weird characters remains a bit of a mystery to me.
Yeah, I think for both Schumer and Jeffries, from my understanding, they are excellent at managing sort of inter-democratic and inter-elected official politics that, like, Jeffries is really well liked by his caucus. I think Schumer is really appreciated by his caucus. But I think the skills that got them to the leadership of those bodies are raising money and making other elected Democrats happy, which are not inspiring skills for voters, right? And I think that's
Yeah,
one of the things
yeah.
that, they both came up in a place where you don't really have to worry about Republicans, that, you only worry about other Democrats, and managing those interpolitical coalitions, that is the key skill. And I think it's, if you compare sort of Chuck Schumer to Harry Reid, who had tough elections and who came up in a state where it was hard to be a Democrat, I think he had a different set of skills and a different set of political instincts that he had because of where he was from.
I wanted to ask about sort of what the sort of long term lesson from Mamdani's election is. So, like, I think like there's two main reasons that Democrats are a little concerned about this. One is that it suggests that their incumbents are not necessarily safe from primary challengers.
Hmm.
The Democratic Party, there was a particular anti-incumbent in the party year in 2018, and AOC's victory was a rare one. For the most part, the party was able to defend its incumbents in Congress. That might not be the case next year. The party, even among Democrats, the Democratic Party is pretty unpopular right now. And another, like one of the big splits that Zoran is right in the middle of is the split in loyalties between Israel and Palestine.
Yeah.
Aggravated by the Israel-Gaza war, and that is something that does potentially divide the Democratic coalition. Zoran has become something of a lightning rod in that, fairly or unfairly. And so I just sort of wonder, like, I know Democrats, more broadly worry that like this will like affect how the Democratic Party is perceived in other parts of the country. Do you have a sense that like voters in competitive districts, swing voters in like Michigan or Nevada in 2026 will be thinking about, when they're thinking about their Democratic candidate, will they be thinking about Zohran Mamdani? Will they be thinking about free
Yeah.
buses? Will they be thinking about Palestine? Or are they going to focus on local issues?
I They might be thinking about Palestine, but not because of Zoran Mamdani. I think that the most important person
Right.
in the 2026 election is Donald Trump, right? Like that is,
Mm-hmm.
and then the second most important are going to be and second and third, I suppose, will be the actual nominees for that race, right? Like I think that the idea that Zoran Mamdani is going to, like, he will probably be a boogeyman that they will use in their, attack ads or whatever, in the same way that,
Sure.
Nancy Pelosi was a boogie woman, and that, they're, the Republicans are not going to, they're going to do whatever they want to do. I don't expect that he's going to be a factor in races outside of New York.
Okay.
But, I think the brand of the Democratic Party potentially is. And, I think I understand people's concern, but we have the ability to separate our candidates in Iowa and in Montana and wherever have the ability to create their own brands. And what plays in New York is not necessarily going to play anywhere else. So I think that that's a little bit of a it's the summer of 2025 and everybody's already bored, and so they're Mondami is new and he's interesting. I think um, it's also you said this at the top of the podcast, but it's impossible to overstate how this is pure only could happen because of it's New York City, right? Brandon Johnson is the mayor
Right.
of Chicago, was also elected on a very progressive platform, also an upset to the establishment, and nobody outside the city of Chicago had any idea what happened. Half the people inside the city of Chicago barely know what happened, right? Like we are talking about this because the national media is based in New York and they really like
Right.
to talk about themselves, right? So there is this is not replicable anywhere else. Like if the Democratic primary for mayor of San Jose, California happened, like we're not going to have an impact here. Um,
Right.
but I do think that larger questions around incumbency and Israel are going to be fascinating to play out. As you said, all incumbents tend to be reelected. Democratic incumbents, especially. One of the things you saw from the Tea Party movement starting in 2010 is Republicans having a little less sort of preciousness around their incumbents than Democrats do. I think that's changing. I think you're seeing a lot more willingness to entertain primary challenges, particularly against older incumbents. I think one of the other factors here on Cuomo is that he is not a young man, and
Sure.
there's a generation of Democratic leaders who people their age 30 years ago were retired. I think it's always worth pointing out that Bill Clinton and George W. Bush are both younger than either Joe Biden or Donald Trump, and that. But this one generation took power in the 90s and they are just not going anywhere.
Yeah.
And I think there are a lot of Democrats have gotten impatient with that. I think a lot of Democratic primary voters are more open to this than they were I think Israel and Palestine is hard. We talked about this last time that we had a podcast. Like, public opinion is all over the map here. You've got people's general sympathy tends to line up with Israel, but the behavior during the Gaza war has been really hard to defend, even for people whose general sympathy lines up there.
Hmm.
It's an issue that really cleaves the Democratic Party. And it's an issue that's really important to a lot of key stakeholders. And I think that's there are, on a lot of congressional races, like, the first policy paper that a congressional candidate will write is their Israel Palestine, because it is a question that they get asked by a lot of
Right.
important people. And there's it's something that motivates donors, it motivates voters, it motivates activists, and it's a true fault line. And I think it's to the long-term detriment of everyone that Netanyahu has aligned not with the United States, but with the Republican Party. I think it has made life really hard for a lot of folks that it's rare in international affairs to have a foreign country so closely associated with one political party. And
Right.
it's really making it's warping a lot of what used to be fairly stable fault lines within the Democratic Party. And I genuinely don't know where that's all going to land.
I don't want to necessarily make an issue out of Kirsten Gillibrand, but actually, I kind of do. I want to ask about this. So, Senator Gillibrand, obviously, she was opposed to Mamdani prior to the primary, and has actually said a number of pretty awful and bigoted things about him even after the election.
Yeah.
She claimed he endorsed a global intifada and made reference to global jihad, neither of which were true. She later apologized for those statements, but I'm trying to. What do you think is going on there? Like, she's not up for reelection until 2030. I don't really get a great sense of her angle. I'm just trying to think of if there's a broader message there for other more centrist Democrats.
Yeah, I'm not really sure either. I'll say there was a viral tweet that went around before the election that said she was endorsing Cuomo, which people were calling her a hypocrite because she helped encourage Al Franken to resign. She didn't actually endorse
Mm-hmm.
Cuomo. That was a hoax. That was one of many pieces of misinformation that we're having to get used to. She was not supportive of Mondame, but she stayed out of that. Her comments on the podcast really were terrible, and I think some of that was
Mm-hmm.
ignorance. One of the things, we want Democratic politicians to be more accessible and to talk more and to take more questions. And there's been a backlash of this kind of, we're going to lock our people up in an ivory tower and only have them in controlled settings. But the downside of doing that is you have people saying ignorant and terrible things on long form podcasts, which is where she said these things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think some of it is a genuine fear of, the unknown. Some of it is, she is running the DSCC this cycle. She's the head of that committee. So she is thinking about the Democratic Party's national brand, but she's also talking to donors all the time. The main job of the DSCC chair is to raise lots and lots of money. And so, if you are talking with hedge fund millionaires and they are freaked out about a Democratic socialist talking about dramatically raising their taxes, like, that is, you take 10 of those calls a day, and it's certainly going to impact the way that you think about what's happening. But yeah, I think she speaks for a lot of people in the sort of centrist establishment of, like, we don't understand this, we don't know where this
Yeah.
guy's coming from. The rules that we thought being, $25 million super PAC investment dumped on New York City broadcast, according to the old rules of politics, should have worked for a candidate with universal name ID, and it
Hmm.
didn't. And I think that there's a lot of unsettled things, and I'm grateful that she has gone and apologized. I think she, recognized that was not a helpful thing toward anybody in the party, right? That I think that, because for all the risks that you have identified to the establishment, I think there is certainly a risk on the other side that Mondami is getting people interested in politics who have not been interested in politics. He's getting folks to turn out. He's getting people to pay attention. Like, those are folks that the Democratic Party needs. And I
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
if I am glad to see some folks in the establishment embracing him more, again, more in the national establishment than in the New York City establishment, because winning in 2026, and more importantly in 2028, is going to require a much bigger tent than we have. And that is true with centrists and it's true with moderates, but it's also true with progressives. And I think that the challenge is not moving the tent toward the center, it is growing the tent and making sure that, both Zoran Mandami and Mikey Sherrill and Abel Sandberger are all comfortably situated in the Democratic Party.
Just watching these events, it was reminding me of some of the sillier accusations by like Bernie Bros back in 2016 about how the establishment was crushing Bernie Sanders, and it was intentionally using all sorts of chicanery to pick Hillary Clinton over him, and like those were largely untrue conspiracy theories for the most part. It seems like the Democratic establishment is trying really hard to make that true right now. Like they're kind of going out of their way to say, okay, we will actually crush this guy.
The New York City Democratic establishment is. I think that I don't think that that's fair about the national, but again, this is the Democratic primary nomination for the mayor of one city in one state. So
right.
The local establishment does matter more. But no, I think we'll see what happens in the general election. The early polling that's coming out shows a really big Mamdani lead. There's a Republican candidate. Cuomo is on the ballot as an independent, and the incumbent mayor is on the ballot as an independent. Right now, those three are all eating each other's support base.
Right.
I think the likeliest outcome, I think, is that the general election is not terribly hard for Mamdani, but he needs to continue to pay attention, and he needs to continue to get out there and communicate his message, because he is an incredible communicator. His mother is an amazing filmmaker, and he definitely learned about storytelling and about branding and about communication from experts at it, and I think has a lot to teach Democratic candidates around the country about how to be authentic and interesting.
Can I ask, does in polling you've seen for this,
Yeah.
does Zohran, facing this divided field, is he over 50%?
I've seen a couple different top line numbers where he's close to 50. I'd have to go back and double check. But I don't. There's certainly, if there's no way to get off the ballot in New York unless you're appointed a judge, I believe. So even if some of those candidates stop running aggressive campaigns, they're going to be on the ballot. So he's going to be facing divided opposition, even if they all figure out a way to have two of the three of them drop their campaigns. But yeah, I think the general election will be interesting. My personal theory is that the closest of the three races in 2025 that matter, the closest will be the New Jersey governor's race, followed by Virginia, followed by New York City. I think I think the Democratic nominee will win all three of them.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, those would be interesting things to watch. Okay. Well, since New York is such a great food town, why don't we talk about food not in New York? How does that sound?
I think that's a great idea. I understand that you were recently in Prague, which is an incredible food town in its own right.
Yes. I was fascinated to learn that. Spent a few days there, tried a lot of different local food. I had expected to see mostly like meat and dumplings, and there definitely is some of that. But a lot of places are getting a lot more creative, and just an interesting range of food. I really enjoyed it. There was one thing that really fascinated me I wanted to mention, and that is a pastry called the kolache, which is basically like it's like a small fruit pie. It looks sort of like a small Danish. Usually has either strawberries or cherries or a cheese filling or something like that. And they're very popular there. It's a long-standing tradition certainly in Prague and in sort of the broader Czech Republic area. And it turns out, I was fascinated to learn, there was a significant Czech immigration into the U.S. in the late 1800s and early 1900s, mostly by farmers. They were having a lot of problems in what is now the Czech Republic. They wanted to sort of start fresh in the U.S. A lot of them settled in Texas and ended up becoming farmers there, multi-generational farmers. And they brought their kolache pastries with them. And so now, there are kolaches all over Texas, it turns out. There's all these bakeries that specialize them.
But they call them kolaches.
Kolaches, yes.
They do not say it right.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. And it turns out they've made some variations on there over the years. Like there are savory versions of them, which they really don't have in the Czech Republic. I went to this one place where they have this one bakery where they have a sort of a map of the kolache diaspora. And you can see it has lists of all the bakeries in Texas where you can go. And there's one in Nashville, and I just tried it
Oh,
yesterday.
amazing.
It's a bakery called Yeast. I tried the it was a sausage and cheese one. It's pretty good. The sweet one I had was, I think, much better. It was an apple cinnamon. It's unsurprisingly, it's an American pastry that is far larger and heavier than its
Yeah.
European equivalent. And I probably should not have eaten the whole thing in one sitting, but it was very good.
When I was in pastry school, the thing I did worst at in France was making eclairs, and the chef looked at me and he looked at my eclairs and he was like, "You're clearly American." And I was like, "What do you mean?" And he was like, "These are family size eclairs. Like, what are you doing?" And I was like, "Well, I think that I think that they're the correct size." But it was the just dripping with disdain.
Excellent. And you had some food experience
Yeah,
recently?
sort of the opposite of this immigrant story. I was in Minneapolis this weekend, and had some friends come to visit, and we went to a restaurant called Owamni, which is I'm embarrassed to say it's the first time I've been. It is. It won the James Beard Award for Best New Restaurant a couple years ago. It's really difficult to get a reservation at, which is part of why I hadn't been yet. But it's a fine dining restaurant, but they only use indigenous North American ingredients. So just ingredients that were present on this continent before Columbus. So it's not trying to be a traditional Native American restaurant, but using native ingredients. So they don't use any dairy, they don't use any chicken eggs, there's no beef, there's no pork, there's no wheat. And so it's
Hmm.
a lot of things that you associate with. We went for brunch and we had dessert, and so many of the things that we think of as the key pastry ingredients they won't use, but they still make incredible stuff. We had these essentially corn pancakes that were just rich and complex and flavorful. We had some bread that was quite dense but really delicious, and then
Hmm.
a coconut and pineapple flan, which was life changing at the end of the meal. But
Wow.
really, it was such an we think of sort of classic American foods, and what Awamni makes you realize is that almost all of those things are colonial, right? They're immigrant. Somebody put wheat on a boat from England, from Europe, and brought it here, and so you think of the whole Great Plains are all growing with non-indigenous things, which is it's wild to
Yeah.
think about. But I think the other thing is that the diet is so much better for you when you aren't using these colonial ingredients. That everything is naturally gluten free. That it's a lot of the dishes that we had just were sort of accidentally vegan, because those are the ingredients that are native to this land. So anybody who comes to Minneapolis should absolutely check it out.
Does this include like chicken and chicken eggs?
Yep, no chicken eggs. They use duck eggs.
Duck eggs.
But
Okay.
yeah, duck is duck, and they use a lot of duck fat, so it's better for you. It's but there's also duck fat. So yeah, we had
Hmm.
bison chilaquiles. We had all sorts of really wonderful things.
No, duck fat is basically vegetable, right? That's my
Yeah,
understanding. But
yeah,
yeah,
exactly.
it's good
I'm
for you.
sure
Yeah.
a vegan might complain, but
Yeah. Um, Thank you so much for this. It's been a great conversation. I appreciate your questions and answers and all this.
yeah, it was great talking to you. I'll talk to you again soon.
Great talking to you, and thank you all for listening. We'll talk again soon. Bye now.